On the afternoon of September 19th, 1985, at approximately 3:30 p.m., a white sedan pulled into the driveway of a modest ranch-style house in a quiet residential neighborhood in Santa Fe's Northeast Heights. The sedan belonged to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Inside were two FBI special agents from the Albuquerque field office who had driven north that afternoon to conduct what they described in their operational notes as a casual interview with Edward Lee Howard, a 33-year-old former CIA employee who had been under periodic surveillance for 4 months. Edward Lee Howard had worked for the CIA for slightly more than 2 years before being dismissed in May 1983. His tenure with the agency had been brief and, by most external measures, unremarkable. He had never served overseas in an operational capacity. He had never recruited a foreign agent. He had never handled classified operations of the sort that typically define a career in clandestine intelligence work. Yet, by September 1985, CIA counterintelligence officials had come to believe that Howard, despite his short and truncated career, had caused catastrophic damage to American intelligence operations in the Soviet Union. The two FBI agents knew when they arrived that afternoon that they were dealing with a man who had betrayed extraordinarily sensitive information to Soviet intelligence. They knew that at least 2 CIA assets in Moscow had been arrested and likely executed as a direct result of information Howard had provided. They knew that multiple ongoing operations had been compromised. They knew that the Soviet Union's KGB had gained detailed knowledge of CIA operational methods, safe house locations, communication protocols, and the identities of CIA officers working under diplomatic cover in the Soviet Union. What the agents did not know, what they would not discover until several hours later, after darkness had fallen, was that Edward Lee Howard would escape from their surveillance that very evening. By the time FBI agents realized Howard had vanished, he was already hundreds of miles away, driving through the night toward the Mexican border, beginning a journey that would take him across international boundaries and eventually into the Soviet Union itself, where he would spend the remainder of his life as a defector, protected and maintained by the same intelligence service he had betrayed his country to assist. Before we continue with Edward Howard's story, if you're fascinated by the untold cases of Cold War espionage and the real human cost behind intelligence operations, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We bring you these documented true stories every week, uncovering the secrets that shaped modern history. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Edward Lee Howard was born on October 27, 1951, in Alamogordo, New Mexico, a small city in the southern part of the state, located near White Sands Missile Range and Holloman Air Force Base. His father, Kenneth Howard, was a captain in the United States Air Force whose career involved rotations through various military installations across the southwestern United States. His mother, Gwendolyn, had been a secretary before marriage and afterward devoted herself to raising Edward and his younger sister Patricia, born 3 years later. Edward's childhood was marked by the transience typical of military families. The Howards moved frequently, from Alamogordo to Tucson, Arizona, then to Colorado Springs, Colorado, and eventually to St. Paul, Minnesota, where Kenneth Howard accepted a position with an aerospace contractor after retiring from the Air Force in the early 1960s. Former teachers and classmates described Edward as bright, articulate, and academically capable, but also somewhat solitary, struggling to form lasting friendships because of the family's frequent relocations. Edward excelled academically despite the disruptions. He demonstrated particular aptitude for languages and history. By the time the family had settled in St. Paul in 1964, when Edward was 13, He had developed an intense interest in international affairs and foreign cultures. He read extensively about the Cold War, the Soviet Union, and espionage. His bedroom bookshelf, according to his sister Patricia's recollection, contained paperback spy novels alongside more serious works of history and political analysis. In 1969, Edward enrolled at the University of Texas at Austin, where he majored in international relations with a concentration in Latin American studies. University records show that he performed well academically, maintaining a grade point average above 3.5 throughout his 4 years. He studied Spanish intensively, achieving near-fluent proficiency. He joined the Model United Nations Club and participated in several university-sponsored conferences on foreign policy. Former roommates and acquaintances described Edward as politically moderate, neither particularly liberal nor conservative, but deeply interested in understanding different political systems and ideologies. Edward graduated from the University of Texas in May 1973. The United States at that time was in the final years of its involvement in Vietnam, and the intelligence community was facing scrutiny following revelations about domestic surveillance programs and covert operations abroad. Despite this climate, or perhaps because of it, Edward had decided during his senior year that he wanted to pursue a career in intelligence work. He applied to the CIA in the spring of 1973, shortly before his graduation. The CIA's recruitment process in the 1970s was extensive and rigorous. Applicants underwent multiple interviews, comprehensive background investigations, psychological evaluations, and polygraph examinations designed to assess both their suitability for intelligence work and their susceptibility to foreign recruitment or blackmail. The process typically took between 6 and 12 months from initial application to final clearance. Edward's application moved through this process without significant complications. Background investigators interviewed his family members, former teachers, university professors, and acquaintances. They examined his financial records, looking for signs of unusual debt or spending patterns that might make him vulnerable to foreign intelligence services. The initial assessment was positive. Edward appeared to be exactly the sort of candidate the CIA sought. Well-educated, intellectually curious, proficient in foreign languages, interested in international affairs, and without any obvious vulnerabilities or security concerns. The background investigation noted that Edward had used marijuana occasionally during his university years, but this was not considered disqualifying given the prevalence of such experimentation among college students in the early 1970s. The psychological evaluation characterized him as intelligent, ambitious, and emotionally stable, though with some indication of what the psychologist described as a need for recognition and validation that could potentially manifest as frustration if career advancement opportunities are limited. Edward was formally offered a position with the CIA in early 1974. However, before he could begin work at the agency, he informed his recruiter that he had accepted a position with the United States Agency for International Development, the federal agency responsible for administering civilian foreign aid. Edward explained that while he remained interested in intelligence work, he wanted to gain some international experience first and believed that working for USAID would provide valuable perspective and language practice. Edward spent approximately 2 years with USAID from 1974 to 1976, working on development projects in Colombia and Peru. Records indicate that he performed his duties competently, received positive performance evaluations from his supervisors, and demonstrated both the linguistic skills and the cultural adaptability that would be valuable for future intelligence work. During his time in South America, Edward met Mary Cedarleaf, a woman from Minnesota who was working as an administrative assistant at the U.S. Embassy in Lima, Peru. They began dating in late 1975 and married in February 1976. When Edward returned to the United States with his new wife in mid-1976, he reapplied to the CIA. His previous clearance had lapsed, so he was required to undergo the full application process again. New background investigation, new psychological evaluation, new polygraph examination. This time, the process proceeded even more smoothly. Edward now had foreign service experience, demonstrated language proficiency, and a stable marriage. He was offered a position as a career trainee, an entry-level program designed to train future operations officers for the CIA's Directorate of Operations, the component of the agency responsible for human intelligence collection, recruiting and handling foreign agents, conducting covert operations, and collecting intelligence through human sources. Edward began work at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, in January 1981. He was 29 years old. Mary was pregnant with their first child. The couple moved into an apartment in suburban Virginia, and Edward began the intensive training program that all career trainees underwent. The career trainee program lasted approximately 18 months. It combined classroom instruction, practical exercises, and rotations through various components of the Directorate of Operations. Trainees learned the fundamentals of intelligence collection: how to assess potential agents, how to make recruitment pitches, how to handle agents securely, how to communicate covertly, how to detect and evade surveillance, how to recognize when an operation had been compromised. They studied the intelligence services of foreign countries, particularly those of the Soviet Union and its Eastern Bloc allies. They learned about technical surveillance, about dead drops and brush passes, about codes and ciphers, about disguises and aliases. Declassified training records and interviews with Edward's former instructors indicate that Edward performed well during the career trainee program. He was regarded as intelligent and motivated. His language skills were excellent. By this point, he had added Russian to his repertoire, studying it intensively during the training program with the goal of eventually serving in Moscow. His performance in practical exercises was generally good, though some instructors noted that he occasionally displayed overconfidence or a tendency to cut corners when he believed he understood a concept or technique. The pinnacle of Edward's training, and the beginning of his eventual downfall, was his assignment to prepare for service in Moscow. In late 1981, as he neared the completion of his career trainee program, Edward was informed that he was being considered for assignment to the CIA's station in Moscow, one of the most challenging and important overseas postings in the entire Directorate of Operations. Moscow was the heart of the primary adversary's intelligence apparatus. Operations there were conducted under constant surveillance by the KGB, requiring extraordinary discipline, meticulous planning, and flawless execution. CIA officers serving in Moscow worked under diplomatic cover, typically as State Department employees at the U.S. Embassy, and they were responsible for handling some of the agency's most valuable assets: Soviet officials who had been recruited to provide intelligence to the United States. To prepare Edward for this assignment, the CIA provided him with extensive briefings on ongoing operations in Moscow. This was standard procedure. Officers being sent to a station needed to understand the full operational picture so they could avoid compromising existing operations or inadvertently coming into contact with agents they were not authorized to handle. Between late 1981 and early 1983, Edward received detailed briefings on virtually every aspect of the CIA's Moscow operations. He learned the identities of CIA officers working undercover at the embassy. He learned the identities of Soviet assets, the individuals who were providing intelligence to the United States, including Adolf Tolkachev, a valuable Soviet engineer who provided information on military aviation technology. He learned about communication methods, the locations of dead drops where officers left materials for agents to collect, the signals used to indicate when a dead drop was loaded or when a meeting was required, the emergency contact procedures used if an agent needed to communicate urgently or believed they were under suspicion. Edward learned about safe houses, apartments maintained by the CIA in Moscow, where officers could meet with agents away from the surveillance that was omnipresent around the embassy. He learned about surveillance detection routes, the specific paths officers drove or walked through Moscow to determine whether they were being followed by KGB surveillance teams before conducting operational activities. He learned about technical capabilities, what sorts of surveillance equipment the KGB employed, what countermeasures the CIA used, what vulnerabilities existed in the agency's operational security. Edward Lee Howard, who had never served overseas as an operations officer and who had never handled a single agent, was given access to virtually every significant secret about CIA operations in Moscow. This was done because the agency believed Edward would soon be working in Moscow himself and needed this information to do his job. It was a calculated risk that the CIA took with every officer assigned to Moscow, providing extensive, sensitive information in advance of their deployment, trusting that the agency's vetting procedures had identified anyone who might pose a security risk. In Edward's case, that trust was about to be seriously misplaced. In early 1983, as Edward's departure for Moscow approached, the CIA conducted a final security review. This was standard practice, a pre-deployment polygraph examination to ensure that the officer being sent overseas had not engaged in any activities since their initial clearance that might compromise their ability to serve securely. The examination was scheduled for April 1983 at CIA headquarters. The polygraph examiner's report, which was partially declassified years later, indicated that Edward displayed significant physiological responses, indicative of deception, when asked questions about drug use, financial problems, and relationships with foreign nationals. Under questioning, Edward acknowledged several issues that had not been disclosed during his previous security clearances. He admitted that he had used cocaine on multiple occasions during the previous 2 years, including while employed by the CIA. He admitted that he and Mary had been experiencing serious marital problems and that he had engaged in at least one extramarital relationship. He acknowledged financial difficulties. He and Mary had accumulated substantial credit card debt, were behind on rent payments, and had borrowed money from family members to cover living expenses. The polygraph examiner concluded that Edward had been deceptive during portions of the examination and recommended further investigation. Over the following weeks, additional interviews were conducted. Edward initially denied some of the allegations, then gradually acknowledged most of them. He explained that he had used cocaine at parties and social gatherings, that he understood this was a serious security concern, but that he had not been addicted and had not believed it was relevant to disclose. He acknowledged the marital problems and the affair, but characterized these as personal matters that he had been working to resolve. He explained the financial difficulties as the result of his wife's spending habits and the high cost of living in the Washington area. CIA security officials evaluated Edward's explanations and determined that they were insufficient. The combination of undisclosed drug use, financial problems, and relationship difficulties represented multiple potential vulnerabilities that an adversary intelligence service could exploit. More fundamentally, Edward's failure to disclose these issues demonstrated a lack of judgment and a willingness to conceal information from his employer, qualities that were incompatible with service as a clandestine operations officer, particularly in a high-threat environment like Moscow. On May 20th, 1983, Edward Lee Howard was informed that he was being dismissed from the CIA. He was told that his security clearance was being revoked, that his assignment to Moscow was canceled, and that his employment with the agency was terminated effective immediately. Later accounts from colleagues who were present indicated that Edward's reaction to the dismissal was one of shock and anger. He protested that his drug use had been minimal and experimental, that his personal problems were being resolved, that he was fully capable of serving in Moscow. Security officials were unmoved. The decision was final. Edward was escorted from CIA headquarters that afternoon. He was debriefed by security officers, a standard exit procedure in which departing employees are reminded of their continuing obligations not to disclose classified information and are warned of the legal consequences of unauthorized disclosure. Edward signed documents acknowledging that he understood these obligations. He returned his badge, his building access cards, and other agency credentials. And then he left Langley, driving home to his apartment in Virginia, his career in intelligence work over before it had truly begun. The immediate impact on Edward and his family was severe. He had resigned from USAID to join the CIA and now found himself unemployed with a pregnant wife, mounting debts, and no clear career prospects. The CIA had been his professional ambition, his identity, the work he had prepared for and trained to do. Now he was suddenly adrift, forced to explain to Mary why he had been dismissed, forced to confront the reality that the life he had envisioned, serving overseas, conducting intelligence operations, being part of something important, was gone. Edward spent the weeks following his dismissal in what Mary later described as a state of depression and rage. He felt betrayed by the CIA. He believed his drug use had been minor and no different from what many of his colleagues engaged in. He resented what he perceived as the agency's hypocrisy and its willingness to discard him despite the time and resources it had invested in his training. He worried about his ability to support his family, and he was consumed by a sense of humiliation, the knowledge that his colleagues knew he had been dismissed, that his parents and friends would learn he had failed, that his career had ended in disgrace. In June 1983, approximately 3 weeks after his dismissal, Mary gave birth to their son, Shuk Lee. The birth should have been a moment of joy, but instead it intensified Edward's financial anxieties and his sense of having failed his family. He began applying for jobs, consulting positions, government contractor roles, anything that might use his language skills and international experience. But explaining his departure from the CIA proved difficult, and few opportunities materialized. In July 1983, Edward and Mary made the decision to leave Virginia and return to New Mexico, where Edward's parents still lived in the Albuquerque area. The cost of living was lower, and they hoped that being closer to family would provide both financial support and emotional stability. They rented a house in Santa Fe, a city Edward had visited during his childhood and where he believed he might find work, given the presence of several national research laboratories and government contractors in the region. The move did little to improve Edward's state of mind. He found part-time work as an analyst for the New Mexico state government, a position that paid a modest salary and required none of the skills or knowledge he had acquired during his intelligence training. He drank heavily. His relationship with Mary continued to deteriorate. Neighbors and acquaintances from this period who were later interviewed by FBI investigators and journalists reported that Edward frequently expressed bitterness about his treatment by the CIA and made statements to the effect that the agency had ruined his life. It was during this period, between the summer of 1983 and the fall of 1984, that Edward Lee Howard made the decision that would transform him from a failed intelligence officer into a traitor who inflicted enormous damage on American national security. He decided to contact Soviet intelligence and offer to sell the information he had been given about CIA operations in Moscow. The exact circumstances of Edward's initial contact with Soviet intelligence remain partially unclear, as neither Edward nor Soviet intelligence officials ever provided complete public accounts. However, based on information that emerged during subsequent investigations and from statements Edward made years later to journalists, a basic reconstruction is possible. Sometime in late 1983 or early 1984, Edward made contact with the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. The initial approach was brief and carefully worded. He indicated that he was a former U.S. government employee who had access to information about American intelligence operations that would be of interest to Soviet intelligence. He proposed a meeting to discuss the terms under which he would provide this information. This method of initial approach was consistent with the tradecraft Edward had been taught during his CIA training. He knew that Soviet intelligence would be suspicious of anyone who approached them claiming to have valuable information, as such approaches could be false flag operations conducted by the CIA itself to identify and compromise Soviet intelligence officers. By making a controlled initial contact and proposing a meeting, Edward was attempting to demonstrate that he was sophisticated enough to be taken seriously while still protecting his identity until he could assess whether Soviet intelligence was genuinely interested. Soviet intelligence, operating through the KGB's Washington Residentura, the contingent of KGB officers working under diplomatic cover at the Soviet embassy, responded to Edward's approach. A meeting was arranged in early 1984. Edward met with a Soviet intelligence officer, and during a brief conversation, Edward provided enough specific details to convince the Soviet officer that he possessed valuable information. The details Edward provided during this initial meeting included names of CIA officers serving in Moscow, descriptions of operational techniques, and references to specific cases. The Soviet intelligence officer agreed to continue the relationship. Additional meetings were arranged over approximately 18 months, from early 1984 through mid-1985. Edward Lee Howard provided Soviet intelligence with what amounted to a comprehensive briefing on CIA operations in Moscow. He identified Soviet citizens who were working as CIA assets, providing their names, their positions within the Soviet government, and details of how they communicated with their CIA handlers. Among those he compromised were Adolf Tolkachev and Sergei Motorin, both of whom were arrested and later executed. He described the locations of dead drops throughout Moscow, specific sites where CIA officers would leave materials for agents to collect. He provided the addresses of safe houses, apartments the CIA maintained for secure meetings with agents. He described surveillance detection routes that CIA officers used when conducting operations. He outlined the specific methods the CIA employed to communicate with agents, including radio broadcasts, coded messages, and emergency signaling procedures. The impact of this information on CIA operations was catastrophic. Soviet counterintelligence officials, armed with the details Howard provided, were able to systematically compromise virtually every significant CIA operation in Moscow. Soviet citizens who had been providing intelligence to the United States were identified, arrested, interrogated, and, in at least 3 documented cases, executed. Dead drops were placed under surveillance, allowing the KGB to identify CIA officers conducting operations. Safe houses were compromised, forcing the CIA to abandon them. Communication methods were understood, allowing Soviet intelligence to intercept or manipulate messages. What made Howard's betrayal particularly devastating was the combination of breadth and specificity. He had not provided just one or two pieces of information that compromised individual operations. He had provided a comprehensive picture of how the CIA operated in Moscow, the entire architecture of the agency's most important station against its primary adversary. Rebuilding these capabilities would require years of effort and enormous expense. The CIA first began to suspect that something was seriously wrong in Moscow in late 1984 and early 1985. Soviet assets, who had been reliably reporting for years, suddenly went silent or were arrested. Operations that should have been secure were clearly under KGB surveillance. Safe houses that were supposed to be unknown to Soviet authorities were raided. The pattern was unmistakable. There had been a major security breach. CIA counterintelligence officers began the painstaking process of trying to determine what had gone wrong. Had one of the agency's Soviet assets been a double agent all along, controlled by the KGB and used to identify other CIA operations? Had technical surveillance, bugs or cameras, compromised secure communications? Had there been a physical break-in at a CIA facility where classified materials were stored? Or had someone with access to sensitive information betrayed that information to Soviet intelligence? By the spring of 1985, CIA counterintelligence officials had begun to focus on the possibility that someone who had been briefed on Moscow operations before serving there had provided that information to Soviet intelligence. A review was conducted of all individuals who had received such briefings in recent years. Edward Lee Howard's name appeared on that list. The initial reaction within CIA security was that Edward was unlikely to be responsible. He had been dismissed more than 2 years earlier, and at the time of his dismissal, there had been no indication that he had any contact with Soviet intelligence. His security violations had been drug use, financial problems, and personal relationship issues, not espionage. Nevertheless, CIA security officials decided to inform the FBI that Howard should be considered a potential suspect and that his activities should be monitored. The FBI opened a preliminary investigation of Edward Lee Howard in May 1985. Agents from the Bureau's Albuquerque field office were assigned to conduct periodic surveillance of Edward and Mary at their home in Santa Fe. The surveillance was intermittent and relatively low-key. Agents would drive past the house several times a day, note whether Edward's car was present, occasionally follow him when he left to observe where he went and whom he met. This level of surveillance was intended to determine whether Edward was engaging in any activities that might indicate contact with Soviet intelligence without alerting him that he was under suspicion. For approximately 4 months, from May through August 1985, the FBI surveillance detected nothing particularly suspicious. Edward's routine appeared mundane. He went to work at his state government job, he came home, he ran errands, he socialized occasionally with neighbors. There were no meetings with individuals who might be Soviet intelligence officers, no visits to diplomatic facilities, no trips to locations that might serve as dead drops or meeting sites. Then, in early September 1985, the CIA received information from a different source. A Soviet intelligence officer who had begun cooperating with the CIA and who provided a general description of an American who had been meeting with Soviet intelligence and providing information about CIA operations in Moscow. The description was not precise enough to definitively identify Edward, but it was consistent with him. A former CIA employee in his early 30s who had been dismissed before serving overseas, who had language skills, and who was currently living in the southwestern United States. Based on this new information, the FBI intensified its surveillance of Edward. Agents were assigned to maintain much closer observation. The Bureau sought authorization for wiretaps on the telephone line at the Howard residence, though technical surveillance inside the house itself faced legal and logistical delays. On September 17, 1985, FBI agents following Edward observed him driving to Albuquerque. He visited a shopping mall, went to a bank, and then drove to the Albuquerque Public Library. Inside the library, Edward spent approximately 45 minutes in the periodicals section. The agents noted that Edward seemed to be paying attention to his surroundings in a way that suggested possible counter-surveillance awareness. He looked around frequently. He changed seats several times. He appeared to observe other library patrons. The FBI agents did not attempt to determine whether Edward had conducted any covert activity while in the library, such as placing or retrieving materials from a dead drop. They were maintaining surveillance at a distance, attempting to avoid alerting Edward that he was being watched. On September 19, 1985, FBI officials in Washington made the decision to have agents interview Edward. The reasoning was that the evidence suggesting Edward's involvement in espionage was substantial but circumstantial. The most direct way to assess whether Edward was guilty was to confront him with questions and gauge his response. It was possible that Edward would confess, particularly if he believed the FBI had evidence of his activities. Even if he did not confess, his reaction to being questioned might provide investigators with insights into his state of mind and his intentions. This decision, to confront Edward directly rather than continuing surveillance in hopes of catching him in an overt act of espionage, would be debated within the FBI and the CIA for years afterward. The argument in favor was that surveillance had produced little actionable intelligence, and the investigation had reached a point where more aggressive action was needed. The argument against was that confronting Edward would alert him that he was under investigation and would give him an opportunity to flee before sufficient evidence could be gathered to arrest and prosecute him. 2 FBI special agents from the Albuquerque field office were instructed to conduct the interview with Edward on the afternoon of September 19th. The interview was to be conducted at Edward's home in Santa Fe. The agents were told to present the conversation as routine to avoid explicitly accusing Edward of espionage, but to ask questions designed to elicit information about his contacts with foreign nationals, his foreign travel, and his current activities. The agents arrived at the house at approximately 3:30 p.m. They parked in the driveway and approached the front door. Mary answered. The agents identified themselves, displayed their credentials, and asked if Edward was home. Mary said he was, and invited them inside. Edward appeared from another room. The agent's report indicated that he seemed tense, but not overtly surprised or alarmed. The agents asked if they could speak with him for a few minutes, and Edward agreed. The conversation took place in the living room. Mary remained present for the initial part of the interview. One agent began by explaining that the FBI was conducting a routine inquiry related to Edward's previous employment with the CIA. He asked whether Edward had maintained any contact with former colleagues from the agency. Edward said he had not. The agent asked whether Edward had traveled outside the United States since leaving the CIA. Edward said he had not. The agent asked whether Edward had been contacted by any foreign nationals or foreign embassy representatives. Edward said he had not. The questions continued for approximately 15 minutes. Edward's answers were brief and unelaborative. He denied any contact with Soviet intelligence or any other foreign intelligence service. He denied providing classified information to anyone. He expressed frustration with the CIA for having dismissed him, saying that he believed the agency had overreacted to minor security issues, but he insisted that he had honored his obligations to protect classified information. At one point during the conversation, Edward asked directly whether he was under investigation for espionage. The agent responded that the FBI was conducting inquiries related to several former CIA employees, and that Edward should not interpret the interview as an accusation. Edward appeared dissatisfied with this response, but did not press the issue further. After approximately 30 minutes, the agents concluded the interview. They thanked Edward and Mary for their cooperation and said they might need to speak with Edward again in the future. They left business cards with contact information and departed. As they drove away from the house, one agent noted in his report that Edward had watched from the front window as they left. The agents parked on a street approximately 2 blocks from the Howard residence. The plan was to maintain surveillance on the house for the remainder of the evening to observe Edward's reaction to the interview. If Edward attempted to contact Soviet intelligence by going to a phone booth to make a call or by traveling to a location that might be a meeting site, the agents would document this activity and it could serve as evidence of his guilt. For approximately 3 hours, from shortly after 4 p.m. until just after 7 p.m., the surveillance proceeded without incident. Edward's car remained in the driveway. The agents observed occasional movement inside the house, but no one left. As darkness fell, the agents settled in for what they anticipated would be a long evening of observation. At approximately 7:15 p.m., Edward and Mary both exited the house and got into Edward's car. The vehicle backed out of the driveway and drove away. The FBI agents followed, maintaining a discreet distance. The route Edward took was circuitous. He drove through residential neighborhoods, made several turns, and appeared to be checking his mirrors frequently. The agents, experienced in surveillance operations, adapted their following pattern to remain undetected. After approximately 20 minutes of driving, Edward's car pulled into the parking lot of a restaurant on the outskirts of Santa Fe. The FBI agents parked nearby and observed as Edward and Mary got out of the car and walked into the restaurant. This appeared to be a dinner outing. The agents maintained their position in the parking lot, watching the restaurant entrance. Approximately 1 hour later, at around 8:30 p.m., Edward and Mary emerged from the restaurant and returned to their car. They drove back toward their home, again following a somewhat indirect route. The FBI agents continued to follow. At approximately 9 p.m., Edward's car pulled into the driveway. Both Edward and Mary exited the vehicle and went into the house. The FBI agents resumed their position and continued surveillance. Lights were visible in various rooms. At approximately 10:45 p.m., the lights in the house were turned off. The agents maintained their position through the night, watching for any indication that Edward might leave again. What the FBI agents did not know was that Edward Lee Howard was no longer in the house. During the drive to and from the restaurant, while FBI agents followed in darkness, Edward and Mary had executed what intelligence professionals call a jack-in-the-box maneuver. The technique was simple but effective. While Mary drove through Santa Fe with FBI agents following at a distance, Edward sat in the front passenger seat. At a moment when the surveillance vehicle temporarily lost visual contact, perhaps while turning a corner, or when another vehicle briefly obstructed the agent's view, Edward quickly ducked below the level of the windows and hid in the back seat of the car. Simultaneously, Mary pulled up a mannequin head topped with a wig into the passenger seat, positioning it so that from a distance it would appear that a person was sitting there. When Mary continued driving, the FBI agents, following from behind in darkness, saw what appeared to be 2 people in the car, Mary driving and a passenger beside her. They did not realize that the passenger was actually a mannequin head, and that Edward was hiding in the back seat. At some point after leaving the restaurant, possibly in the parking lot or on a darkened street, Edward slipped out of the car undetected, while Mary continued home with the mannequin still positioned in the passenger seat to maintain the illusion. Edward made his way on foot to a rental car that had been pre-positioned. He drove away while Mary returned home alone, went through the motions of a normal evening, and turned off the lights to suggest they had both gone to bed. At approximately 6:30 a.m. on the morning of September 20th, 1985, fresh FBI agents arrived to relieve the overnight surveillance team. The new team took up positions with a view of the house and settled in to continue watching. The morning passed quietly. There was no movement at the house. Edward's car remained in the driveway. By mid-morning, the agents began to wonder whether Edward and Mary might be sleeping late. At approximately 11:30 a.m., one of the agents walked past the house on foot and observed that it appeared quiet, with no visible activity. By early afternoon, the surveillance team had become concerned. They had not observed any movement for more than 16 hours. The agents contacted their supervisor and requested permission to approach the house to verify that Edward was actually there. Permission was granted. At approximately 2:15 p.m. on September 20th, 1985, FBI agents approached the house and knocked on the door. There was no answer. They knocked again, more loudly. Still no answer. They walked around the exterior, looking in windows. The house appeared empty. Edward's car was in the driveway, but there was no sign of Edward or Mary inside. The agents obtained authorization to enter the house. Using the justification that there might be a safety concern, they entered through the front door with assistance from local law enforcement. The house was empty. There was no sign of Edward or Mary. Beds had been slept in. Dishes were in the sink. Clothing and personal items appeared undisturbed, but the residents were gone. As agents searched the house, they discovered evidence that began to explain what had happened. In the garage, they found mannequin heads, the sort used to display wigs, and a woman's wig on a wig stand. In a bedroom closet, they found several changes of clothing laid out. In a trash can, they found torn papers that, when pieced together, appeared to be maps of the southwestern United States, with certain routes highlighted. By the time FBI agents realized that Edward had escaped, he had been gone for approximately 20 hours and had a substantial head start. An immediate nationwide alert was issued. The FBI contacted border security at all ports of entry along the U.S.-Mexico border. Agents visited car rental agencies in Santa Fe and Albuquerque looking for recent rentals. Airlines were contacted to determine whether Edward had purchased tickets. The investigation quickly determined that Mary had known about and participated in Edward's escape. When FBI agents interviewed her in the days following Edward's disappearance, she initially claimed not to know where her husband had gone. However, telephone records obtained through subpoena showed that Mary had made several calls in the weeks before Edward's escape to settle bills and make arrangements suggesting an extended absence. Mary was eventually granted immunity from prosecution in exchange for her cooperation. She acknowledged that she and Edward had planned his escape after the FBI interview on September 19th. Recognizing that the interview meant Edward was under investigation and that arrest was likely imminent, she confirmed the jack-in-the-box maneuver and explained that Edward had made his way to a pre-positioned rental car. She said that Edward had told her he was planning to leave the country, but had not specified where he would go or how he would get there. Edward's trail went cold at the U.S.-Mexico border. On September 24, 1985, 5 days after his escape, a security guard at a border crossing reported that a man matching Edward's description had crossed into Mexico on foot on the evening of September 22nd. The man had presented identification documents and had told the border guard that he was an American tourist planning to spend a few days in Mexico. The guard had not had any reason to detain him. Weeks passed with no confirmed sightings of Edward. Then, in mid-October 1985, the CIA received information from intelligence sources in Europe that Edward Lee Howard had arrived in Moscow. The information suggested that he had made his way from Mexico to Central America, then to Europe, possibly through connections with Soviet intelligence officers stationed in those regions, and had eventually been transported to the Soviet Union. On October 25, 1985, approximately 5 weeks after his escape from Santa Fe, Soviet state media announced that Edward Lee Howard had been granted political asylum in the Soviet Union. The announcement characterized Edward as a victim of political persecution by American intelligence services and claimed that he had fled the United States because he feared retribution for exposing illegal activities by the CIA. The announcement confirmed what the CIA and FBI had feared. Edward Lee Howard, who possessed detailed knowledge of agency operations in Moscow, was now in the custody of the same intelligence service he had betrayed those operations to. Whatever information he had not yet provided to Soviet intelligence, he was now in a position to provide in thorough debriefings conducted by KGB interrogators. In the aftermath of Edward's defection, the CIA conducted a comprehensive damage assessment. The assessment, completed over more than a year, concluded that Edward Lee Howard had caused damage to American intelligence operations that would rank among the most significant intelligence failures of the Cold War. At least 3 Soviet citizens who had been working as CIA assets were arrested, tried for treason, and executed between 1985 and 1987. Among these were Adolf Tolkachev, a Soviet aviation expert who had provided invaluable intelligence on military technology, and Sergei Motorin, a KGB officer who had been recruited by the FBI. These individuals had provided valuable intelligence to the United States on Soviet military capabilities, political decision-making, and intelligence operations. Their loss deprived the CIA not only of the intelligence they had been providing, but also of the years of effort and resources that had gone into recruiting and maintaining them as assets. Numerous CIA operational sites in Moscow, dead drops, safe houses, observation posts, were compromised and had to be abandoned. Communication methods that had been effective for years became useless, forcing the CIA to develop entirely new protocols. Surveillance detection routes that CIA officers had relied upon to determine whether they were being followed by the KGB were now known to Soviet counterintelligence, making it extremely difficult for officers to conduct operations without being detected. The psychological impact within the CIA was also significant. The fact that Edward had been able to inflict such damage despite never having served overseas as an operational officer raised profound questions about the agency's training and security practices. How had someone so recently dismissed for security violations been able to compromise such sensitive operations? Why had the warning signs, Edward's financial problems, his bitterness toward the CIA, his statements about feeling betrayed, not prompted closer monitoring? Why had the FBI been unable to detect his contact with Soviet intelligence until it was too late to prevent his escape? The CIA's damage assessment estimated that repairing the operational capabilities that Howard had compromised would require between 5 and 8 years of sustained effort and would cost tens of millions of dollars. This estimate proved conservative. Some of the assets Howard had betrayed had provided unique access to Soviet decision-making processes that took more than a decade to replace. Some operational techniques and communication methods that had been compromised had to be entirely redesigned, requiring years of testing and implementation. In December 1985, the U.S. Department of Justice issued a federal warrant for Edward Lee Howard's arrest on charges of espionage. The charges specified that Edward had conspired to commit espionage, had communicated classified information to a foreign government, and had compromised the identities of intelligence agents. Because Edward was now in the Soviet Union and beyond the reach of American law enforcement, the warrant was largely symbolic, a formal legal acknowledgement of his crimes and a declaration that he would be prosecuted if he ever returned to United States jurisdiction. Edward Lee Howard remained in the Soviet Union for the rest of his life. He was provided with an apartment in Moscow, a modest stipend, and protection by Soviet intelligence services. Journalists who interviewed Edward in subsequent years reported that his life in Moscow was comfortable but isolated. He had no friends outside of the intelligence officers assigned to handle him. He had no meaningful occupation. He spent his days reading, learning Russian more fluently, and occasionally meeting with KGB officials for conversations about intelligence work and tradecraft. In 1986, Edward granted an interview to an American journalist in which he defended his decision to provide information to Soviet intelligence. He claimed that he had done so because he believed the CIA had treated him unjustly, and because he wanted to prevent what he characterized as aggressive American intelligence operations that he believed increased Cold War tensions. He denied that his primary motivation had been money, though he acknowledged that he had accepted payment from Soviet intelligence. The payments he received, based on patterns in similar cases and statements Edward made, likely totaled between $30,000 and $50,000 over the 18-month period he was in contact with Soviet intelligence, a modest sum that hardly justified the damage he caused. Edward's parents, Kenneth and Gwendolyn Howard, gave occasional interviews in which they expressed conflicted feelings about their son's actions. They acknowledged that what Edward had done was wrong and that he would have to live with the consequences, but they also maintained that Edward had been treated unfairly by the CIA and that his dismissal had been disproportionate to his security violations. They declined to condemn Edward unequivocally, instead emphasizing that he was their son and that they continued to love him despite what he had done. Mary Howard divorced Edward in 1986. She retained custody of their son Lee and resumed using her maiden name, Cedarleaf. She returned to the Minneapolis area where she lived quietly, working in administrative positions and later in healthcare, raising Lee largely as a single mother. She declined most interview requests and rarely spoke publicly about Edward after their divorce. Court records show she received no financial support from Edward after his defection, as he had no legitimate income and no assets that could be attached for child support purposes. Lee Howard grew up with the knowledge that his father was a fugitive living in the Soviet Union. Mary attempted to shield Lee from the full details of his father's crimes during his early childhood, but as Lee grew older and began to understand the situation more fully, the knowledge of what his father had done became a source of confusion, shame, and anger. Lee had occasional contact with his father through letters and, later, through phone calls, but the relationship was distant and strained. He has maintained his privacy, declining to speak publicly about his father or his experiences growing up as the son of a defector. In the early 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, there was brief speculation that Edward might attempt to return to the United States or negotiate some sort of resolution to his legal situation. By this time, the operations he had compromised had long since been rebuilt or abandoned, and the intelligence he had provided was largely obsolete. However, the U.S. government made clear that if Edward returned to American jurisdiction, he would be arrested and prosecuted for espionage. The federal warrant issued in 1985 remained active, Edward, understanding this, remained in Moscow. Edward continued to grant occasional interviews to journalists and researchers studying Cold War espionage, though these became less frequent as the years passed and interest in his case waned. In these later interviews, Edward expressed what appeared to be a mixture of justification and regret. He maintained that he had been treated unjustly by the CIA and that his decision to provide information to Soviet intelligence had been a response to that injustice. At the same time, he acknowledged that people had died as a result of his actions and that he had destroyed his relationship with his family. When asked whether he would make the same choices again, Edward typically avoided giving a direct answer, suggesting that the question was too complicated to answer simply. On July 12, 2002, at the age of 50, Edward Lee Howard died at his dacha outside Moscow under circumstances that were never fully clarified. Russian authorities reported that he had died as a result of a fall from a staircase, possibly caused by intoxication, and that his death appeared to be accidental. His neck was broken. However, intelligence analysts and journalists speculated that Edward's death might have been arranged by Russian intelligence services, either because he had outlived his usefulness or because he had been involved in activities that Russian authorities found problematic, or simply because maintaining and protecting him for 17 years had become burdensome. No definitive evidence of foul play was established, and Edward's death was officially ruled accidental. He was buried in Moscow. His funeral was sparsely attended. His parents did not travel to Russia for the service. Mary and Lee were not present. A small number of individuals who had known Edward during his years in Moscow attended, along with a few intelligence officers who had handled him during his defection. The question of Edward Lee Howard's motivations remained subject to debate even after his death. He had never been a committed ideologue. Unlike some Cold War spies who betrayed their countries because of deep political convictions, Edward appeared to have had no particular ideological commitment to either side. His espionage seemed to have been motivated primarily by a combination of personal grievance, financial need, and a desire for revenge against the institution that had rejected him. This lack of clear ideological motivation made Edward's case particularly troubling for intelligence agencies. It suggested that even individuals without strong political beliefs or obvious character flaws could be recruited by foreign intelligence services if the right combination of circumstances aligned: job loss, financial pressure, personal humiliation, and access to valuable information. It suggested that the human vulnerabilities that intelligence services exploit, resentment, desperation, wounded pride, are universal and can emerge even in individuals who pass background checks, psychological evaluations, and polygraph examinations. The CIA and FBI conducted comprehensive reviews of their security procedures in the aftermath of the Howard case. Changes were implemented to reduce the risk of similar compromises in the future. More stringent monitoring of employees who were dismissed for security reasons was instituted. Procedures for briefing employees on sensitive operations were revised to minimize the number of individuals who had access to comprehensive information about multiple operations. Communication security was enhanced to reduce the risk that compromised operations could lead to cascading failures across entire stations. Despite these reforms, the Howard case illustrated the fundamental tension at the heart of intelligence work. Agencies needed to trust their employees with extraordinary secrets in order to conduct operations. But that trust created vulnerabilities that adversaries could exploit. No vetting process could eliminate all risk. No security procedure could guarantee that an employee who became disgruntled, desperate, or morally compromised would not betray sensitive information. The question was not whether such betrayals would occur. They almost certainly would, occasionally, despite the best efforts of security officials, but how to minimize their frequency and limit their impact when they did occur. For the families of the Soviet assets who were executed as a result of Edward's betrayal, the consequences were devastating and permanent. These individuals had made extraordinary personal decisions to provide intelligence to the United States, often at enormous risk to themselves and their families. They had done so for various reasons: ideological opposition to the Soviet system, desire for financial security, hope that their information might help prevent war or reduce international tensions. They had placed their trust in the CIA's ability to protect them and maintain the secrecy of their identities. That trust was betrayed not by the CIA officers who handled them, but by Edward Lee Howard, a man they never knew existed, who betrayed them for reasons that had nothing to do with them personally. The families of these executed assets, spouses, children, parents, faced not only the grief of losing loved ones, but also the social stigma and practical difficulties that came with being associated with someone convicted of treason in the Soviet Union. Some family members faced their own arrests or interrogations. Others lost jobs, apartments, educational opportunities. The harm rippled outward far beyond the individuals who were executed. Mary Cedarleaf. Howard rebuilt her life in Minnesota after her divorce from Edward. People who knew her in later years reported that she rarely discussed her former husband or the circumstances of his defection. She worked, raised her son, maintained a small circle of friends, and lived as ordinary a life as circumstances permitted. By all accounts, she bore no legal responsibility for Edward's crimes. She had cooperated with investigators after being granted immunity, and her participation in his escape appeared to have been motivated by loyalty to her husband rather than any sympathy for his betrayal of classified information. Nevertheless, Mary lived with the consequences of Edward's choices. She carried the knowledge that her former husband had caused deaths, had compromised national security, and had spent years living as a defector in a country that had been America's primary adversary. She had to explain to her son, as he grew older, who his father was and what he had done. She had to decide how to respond when Lee asked whether they could visit Edward in Moscow, whether Edward might someday return, whether what Edward had done made Lee himself somehow complicit or tainted. The knowledge that his father had caused deaths and compromised national security operations created a burden for those left behind to carry. The question of accountability in the Howard case extended beyond Edward himself. CIA officials who had approved his initial hiring despite the drug use disclosed during his first polygraph examination faced criticism for failing to recognize the security risk he posed. Officials who had provided Edward with comprehensive briefings on Moscow operations before he had actually deployed faced questions about whether such extensive pre-deployment briefings were necessary or prudent. The FBI was criticized for waiting too long to interview Edward directly and for conducting the interview in a manner that gave him an opportunity to flee. All of these criticisms had merit, and all reflected genuine failures of judgment or procedure. However, they also reflected the inherent difficulty of intelligence work conducted by human beings operating under conditions of uncertainty and incomplete information. Security officials who approved Edward's hiring in 1980 had no way of knowing that he would be dismissed 3 years later or that he would respond to that dismissal by committing espionage. Officials who briefed him on Moscow operations were following established procedures designed to prepare officers for overseas service. FBI agents who interviewed him made judgments about how to balance the need for information against the risk of alerting him to the investigation. All of these decisions were made by individuals trying to do their jobs competently within systems that were designed to achieve multiple objectives: recruiting talented officers, preparing them adequately for challenging assignments, investigating security threats, building prosecutable cases. The fact that these decisions, in retrospect, created the conditions for Howard's betrayal does not mean the individuals who made them were incompetent or negligent. It means they were operating within inherently difficult circumstances where perfect security was impossible and where trade-offs were necessary. This is not to excuse the failures or to suggest that lessons should not be learned and improvements should not be made. The CIA and FBI did learn lessons from the Howard case, and they did implement improvements. However, it is important to understand that intelligence work, like all human endeavors, involves imperfect people making decisions under uncertainty, and that even well-designed systems, staffed by competent professionals, will occasionally fail in catastrophic ways. The human cost was incalculable. At least 3 people were executed directly as a result of Howard's betrayal. Dozens of other individuals, assets who were under suspicion but not definitively compromised, CIA officers whose cover was blown, family members of executed assets, experienced significant harm. The families of these individuals lost loved ones, faced persecution, and spent years or decades living with the consequences of Howard's actions. Perhaps Edward's inability or unwillingness to fully confront the consequences of his actions was itself a consequence of the way he had rationalized those actions at the time. To betray classified information to a hostile intelligence service, to compromise operations that protected human assets, to cause deaths, these are not actions that most people can undertake without constructing elaborate justifications that minimize or rationalize the harm. Once such justifications are constructed and internalized, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to dismantle them and acknowledge that what one has done was wrong, driven by grievances that in retrospect seem trivial compared to the consequences. The Howard case remained classified in many of its details for years after Edward's death. Even today, certain information, the specific identities of some assets he compromised, the full extent of operational techniques he revealed, details of CIA security procedures that were found to be inadequate, remains protected. This is standard practice in intelligence matters where protecting ongoing operations and methods takes precedence over public disclosure even decades after events have occurred. However, enough information has been declassified or reported by journalists to establish the essential facts of the case and to understand its significance. Edward Lee Howard was a failed intelligence officer who betrayed sensitive information out of bitterness and financial need. He caused the deaths of at least 3 people, compromised critical intelligence operations, and inflicted lasting damage on American national security. He escaped justice through a combination of careful planning and investigative missteps. He lived in exile for 17 years and died in circumstances that remain unclear. And he left behind a son who grew up in the shadow of his father's crimes, a former wife who rebuilt her life as best she could, and families in Russia who lost loved ones because of information he provided. The moral complexity of the case lies not in whether Edward's actions were wrong, they clearly were, but in understanding how someone who was not inherently evil, who was not a committed ideologue, who had once genuinely aspired to serve his country, could make choices that caused so much harm. It lies in recognizing that the systems designed to prevent such betrayals, security clearances, background checks, psychological evaluations, polygraph examinations, can never be perfect, and that intelligence agencies must accept some level of risk if they are to recruit and train the officers they need to conduct operations. It lies in acknowledging that the people who were harmed by Edward's betrayal, the executed assets, their families, the CIA officers whose careers were disrupted, Mary and Lee Howard, were innocent victims of choices made by a man who placed his own grievances above their lives and well-being. And it lies in understanding that even when accountability is clear and consequences are severe, the damage caused by betrayal is permanent and irreparable. Edward Lee Howard's defection occurred at a particular moment in Cold War history, 1985, when tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union remained high, but when changes were beginning to emerge that would eventually lead to the end of the Cold War. Within 5 years of Howard's escape, the Berlin Wall would fall, Eastern European communist governments would collapse, and the Soviet Union itself would dissolve. The intelligence operations he had compromised, the assets whose deaths he had caused, the information he had provided, all of it rendered obsolete as the geopolitical landscape transformed. This does not diminish the harm he caused or excuse his actions. The people who died were just as dead, regardless of whether the Cold War continued or ended. The families who suffered lost just as much. The operations that had to be rebuilt required just as much time and resources. But it does place his betrayal in a broader context. He destroyed lives and compromised operations in service of a Soviet system that would cease to exist within a few years for payment that amounted to a modest sum. Edward Lee Howard was 33 when he chose revenge over integrity. He was 50 when he died in a country that had used him and ultimately may have discarded him. And in between, he lost everything he thought betrayal would protect: his freedom, his family, his future, and any claim to the life he believed the CIA had stolen from him. Whether his 17 years in Moscow, dependent on intelligence services that maintained him as an asset rather than a person, constituted justice or simply consequence is a question without a clear answer. What is certain is that he caused harm that far exceeded whatever grievances justified his actions in his own mind, and that the victims of his choices, the executed, their families, his own son, paid prices they never deserved for decisions they never made.